Welcome back to a Sew Willow tutorial. Today we're going to be making the Stargazer Wearable Quilt pattern. It's a convertible pattern that allows you to use your quilt as both a blanket and to wear it as a poncho and to neatly fold the hood away. In this tutorial I'll walk you through all the steps. You will need the pattern, which you can purchase from my Etsy shop or the Sew Willow website. And then we'll begin and I'll show you how to piece all the pieces together for the patchwork, how to do chain stitching, and lots of tips along the way to help make your quilt a lot easier to put together. I'll show you how I quilt on a normal sewing machine and how I stitch that hood into the quilt. I'm even going to show you how I tea stained my quilt to give it a vintage look rather than that really bright crisp feel of a newly made quilt. For this project I'm using Kona Cotton Solids in various colours. I wanted to keep it a really rich, warm, earthy tone, and I'll put all the links of the fabrics I've used below. When you've printed your pattern, you just want to double check the test box to make sure it's printed at 100% and then continue to cut out all the templates provided. I find the quickest way to cut out all my fabric pieces is to stick the templates onto a quilting ruler, and then I fold my fabric into fours, and then I'll cut long strips and then use the template on the ruler to just cut the strip into squares, or in the case of the triangles I'll cut the squares first, and once they're all cut I'll turn my ruler at a 45-degree angle just from edge to edge to cut out the triangle. It's really quick this way to cut a lot of pieces in very little time. Now whilst you're cutting out your templates, you do want to make sure that you're going to leave enough fabric for the back of the hood. So make sure to cut that piece right at the start, set it aside, and then you can continue using your natural fabric to cut out the rest of the templates. You can see even with the bigger templates like template D, the bigger triangle, I'm sticking the template onto the ruler and then cutting off my selvage edges, trimming it to squares, and then cutting from corner to corner at a 45-degree angle. I'm going to set aside all of the scraps of fabric I have left over to use for the binding later on. Now for the batch piecing, I like to take all of my pieces over to the cutting table and lay them out as per the steps. So in this instance I'm using a white bee and a red bee, and then I'm going to have the edges I'm sewing facing to the right and lay them on top of one another. And then I take that over to my sewing machine and I'm going to put one at a time through the machine to stitch that edge. But I'm going to continue to chain stitch. So instead of cutting the thread for every piece, I just put one piece after the other through the machine, chain stitching, and then I'll cut them apart once all of the pieces have been stitched along one edge. In this clip you can see a close-up where I'm using a sewing pig in order to chain stitch, and I'm using it at the start of my stitching and end of the stitching, and it helps me to save a lot of thread. Once again I just continue that. I go on my cutting table, match up all the pieces I'm trying to sew together, and align all the edges to the right that I'm going to be sewing along. Make sure they're all aligned, pick up those pieces and just continue chain sewing so that I can batch sew rather than doing one piece at a time. This saves me so much time and makes the project go a lot quicker. At this stage I also simply finger press open any edges until I've got all of the first section pieces done. So once I've done a whole bunch of shapes, especially for the first section, like maybe just the first page of all the shapes, I then take them to my ironing board and I press the seams. I like to press my seams to one way, normally towards the darker color or maybe towards the more complex area, and then I snip all my little dog ears, and I have a little felt covered bowl that I use that catches threads and these little corners really well. Once all the batch piecing is done, it's time to start joining the strips, also known as rows in traditional quilting. I've called them strips for this project. I found the best way to do this was to have my screen open with the pattern on the screen facing my cutting table, or if you have a printed copy that works well too. And then I start laying out my strips to make sure they're exactly the same as the strips on the instructions, with everything facing the right direction. Then section by section, I take the pieces that I'm going to sew together next, lay them on top of one another, making sure the edges I'm sewing face to the right, take them to the sewing machine, stitch them together, and bring them back to the cutting table to lay them in the correct position, checking that they match the on-screen instruction. Once my strips are sewn together, I use a piece of paper that I pin to the strips to mark them and set them aside. I continue to follow this process when joining the strips together. Unfortunately, I seem to have lost my footage from when I joined the strips, but it's pretty much the same process to join the strips, then the block, and bring them together until you have a completed quilt top with that central diamond piece open, and you should be able to see the wadding through that, and that's where we're going to fit the hood. So then when you've done the patchwork for your quilt top, it's time to do the basting. There's lots of ways to baste quilts. You can either go on the floor and use a basting spray, making sure that your backing fabric is taped down and nice and taut before you put on your quilting or your wadding layer, and then put your quilt top on top. I'm making sure I'm smoothing it from the center outwards. I did have a go at trying to do the basting at the wall. This did not work for me, but I think my masking tape was not strong enough. So I think if you have strong enough tape up and you don't have floor space, this is absolutely another sensible way to do it. Once basted, I start drawing out my quilting lines using some chalk and a long ruler to draw out the lines as per the pattern instructions. Starting with the central lines of my quilt, I'm going to roll in the edges of my quilt so that I can take it onto my sewing table without the whole quilt draping all over the place. I recommend using a walking foot when quilting, but as you can see here, I'm not using a walking foot in this instance. I didn't find it was really necessary because I'm quilting from the center of the quilt, so that empty diamond area, all the way outwards for each of my lines. I'm using quilting cotton thread specifically for machine quilting. You can see here on the back that there's no bunching of fabric happening, and that's because I'm ensuring I'm going outwards. I'm checking my layers as I sew, making sure to keep that fabric nice and smooth before I mark up my next set of lines to quilt. I'm doing each quarter of the quilt separately. In order to keep the threads on my quilting lines really tidy, after I've done all my quilting, I turn my quilt over and then I like to pull on the bobbin thread to lift the thread from the front of the quilt up, and then I knot my threads together. Here you can see a close-up of how I do that. So pulling on the bobbin thread and using a pin, pull the thread from the front of the quilt up, and once I've got that, I will just knot those ends together and snip down, and then I've secured my threads on the back. Once you've done all the patchwork for your side hood panels, it's time to start layering the hood pieces as well as the back hood pieces for basting. So you want to make sure that both the side hood panels and the back hood panel can fit on, and cut away any overlap, checking with your paper pattern that everything fits. I simply pinned my pieces on rather than basting with basting spray or with stitches, and then I just cut the hood side panel pieces separate to the back hood panel piece. Then I went ahead and drew my quilting lines with my chalk, ready for taking to the machine to quilt the layers together. Before I draw the quilting lines for the back hood layer, I actually mark out my entire pattern piece on the fabric, and then I go ahead and draw the quilting lines as per the pattern instructions, especially that folding line that's already marked on the pattern. That's really important to mark out. Using a quilting ruler, just making sure to get everything symmetrical. Once quilted, I'm doing the same on the back of the hood panel pieces. I'm pulling my threads up, knotting them to tidy them. And then for the side hood pieces, I'm placing the pattern pieces on top of the quilted side hood pieces, cutting those pieces out, and then I'm ready to start joining the hood together. If you're wondering how to ease the straight edge of the back hood panel to the curve of the side hood panel, this is how you do it. I like to start with the front end and then just turn it and pin it, turn and pin all the way around. You'll find that the notch that you marked on the side hood panel will match up to the seam allowance mark on the corner of the back hood panel. And that's going to be the line indicating where you're going to sew to on the hood seams. Back at my machine, I'm just double checking my seam allowance, and then I start to stitch together. Note how as I go around I'm removing pins but also moving any bulky fabric around the bottom of the back hood panel, just to move it out the way to make sure I'm not catching any fabric. This is part of the easing. You're kind of slightly stretching one edge to fit the other edge. Once your hood is sewn together, it's time to start preparing some binding. I just mark out 2.5 inches with my quilting ruler, and I just cut strips from whatever fabric I've got left over. In order to join those strips together, I cut the edges of the strips to a 45-degree angle, and then at 90 degrees match them up, sew them together, and then I've got long joining strips. I press those seams open and then I fold the binding strips in half and press. To bind the inner edges of the hood seams, I simply match up the raw edges of the binding strip to the raw edges of the hood seams. Once sewn in place, I simply fold the binding strip around to the other side, and then you can either hand sew that in place, or if the binding is wrapping around far enough, you can stitch in the ditch from the side you've just joined to catch. Once I've done the inner seams, it's time to bind the front edges of the hood, doing the same raw edges to raw edges all the way around, stitch and then fold over, and then for this edge and the rest of my edges I'm hand sewing the binding in place because I really love that look, especially after washing a quilt. I'm also taking a moment to cut away any excess bulk across the seams of the hood before stitching the binding in place. For those of you using ready-made quilted fabric, you will be using the pattern piece to cut your inner diamond area open, placing it centrally on the fold of your fabric. For the rest of us, cut away the diamond area where the batting is showing, making sure you're not trimming away any extra seam allowance from your patchwork pieces. And then baste together the front corners of the hood. The following steps are really important for the neck opening. You want to stay stitch that diamond area into the seam allowances. That's going to be really important to stabilize that neck edge. And then do not skip the step. Snip into the corners. The snipping right into the corners, right up to where the threads are, is what's going to help you to pivot and turn those awkward corners to get the hood to fit into that diamond shape. After you've marked the back and the front end of your quilt, so those will be the shorter sides, make sure you mark which side you want to be the neck opening of your quilt. If you're doing the patchwork, the front and the back ends have the orange triangle at the end of the central strip. So with the hood turned inside out, align one straight edge of the hood side panel with the straight edge of the diamond opening facing that neck edge of the quilt. Pin carefully and stitch using the stay stitch line as your guide. You're then going to fold the quilt in half, wrong sides out with the hood positioned to the inside, and then you're going to match up a second neck edge going from one point of the diamond to the other point, making sure you get as straight a line as possible and folding away any excess fabric so that when you're stitching you don't catch any folds of fabric. Continue to match and stitch each straight edge at a time, going from corner to corner, using the snipping areas as a pivot point to pivot your fabric out of the way as you stitch. If you carefully watch the footage here where I'm sewing, you can see how I'm taking my time, ensuring that that line is really straight, and then when I get towards the end of that stitch line, I keep sort of pulling and moving any fabric away. I also make sure that I'm catching my inner bound hood seams to one side, and then I go all the way to the edge, and when I get to the corner, notice again how I take my time and fold any excess fabric out of the way, making sure I'm going to get a sharp edge without going beyond that corner edge so that I don't catch the other edge of the snipped corner. You want to avoid any bunching of the fabric in the corners. Now finally, here you can see what the hood looks like in place. You can see there's a little bit of bunching of fabric, but not too much. The corners don't really have to be perfect because they are going to be covered up by the triangles, but you do want to make sure they're secure. At this point, you can also start testing the fold of the hood. I just tend to fold along that stitched line, pressing the hood under one way first, getting that corner nice and neat, and then folding under the other side. You can at this point even start pressing your hood just so that it can start getting that folding memory to fold under to lay nice and neat. And then finally, to finish the inner neck edges of the hood, you really want to be cutting away any bulk. So I go in and I cut away the inner layer of the batting, and I'll even trim away the inside edge just to kind of give me a bit of a step seam and make it a lot less bulky. And then you're ready to go ahead and bind the inner neck edges. I chose to just use my backing fabric, which was a flannel sheet. I chose to hand finish the inside edge of my binding on the neck because it makes it a lot less bulky than adding another stitch line with a machine. And now for some finishing touches. We're going to be sewing the triangles. Stitch all the way around the edge, leaving a turning gap, making sure to backstitch before and after. And then you're going to snip the corners, and then either use a kebab stick or a blunt knitting needle to turn your triangles right side out, really pressing out those corners to get nice sharp triangles. And then we'll be using one of the triangles to make our buttonhole. So mark a buttonhole on one of the triangles, Sew your buttonhole, double check the button will definitely fit through that gap, and then it's time to position it on the front. Position these triangles slightly down from the diamond corner edges, and then make sure you're going to be pinning them in place and spacing them all equally before you stitch them, and you're going to top stitch them right along the edges to secure them. And also make sure you fold under that turning gap that you left. Then position your button and sew your button in place, making sure it's going to be pulling that diamond shape nice and tight into that gap when you close the hood. And finally, it's time to bind your quilt. So once you've cut away any excess wadding and you've squared off your quilt, you're going to be attaching your binding, making sure to be mitered corners. Stitch your binding in place, and then again I chose to hand stitch from the front of my quilt just because I really like the way it looks when washed. After washing my quilt, I decided to tea stain it. This is how I did it. I made a big pot of tea using English tea, rooibos tea, and a spoon of instant coffee in a pot until I kind of got the color mix I was after, knowing I was going to dilute them. I then took this mixture to the bathroom where I poured hot water into a tub, and then I ended up adding the tea mixture to that to dilute it. I tested the color to make sure I liked it, and then after washing my quilt, I put it wet and freshly washed into this tea bath, making sure to fully submerge it. It was pretty hot, so I'd recommend you actually use the stick as you'll see me doing in the next clip. I kept submerging it, and every few minutes I would just come along making sure nothing was sticking out. I did that for 20 minutes, and then I poured an ice cold bath of water in a tub and some salt, and then I dunked that straight into the salt bath. After the salt bath, I gave it a good rinse until the water started running clear. And there you go. I am so happy with how this turned out. I really hope you've enjoyed making this quilt and that you get to wear it lots. I'm going to be taking it camping and I can't wait. Let me know how you get on, and I can't wait to see how your Stargazer wearable quilt turns out. Thank you for watching.